The smoke of the Second World War had barely faded when a new tension began to settle across the world. Empires had fallen, cities lay in ruins, and millions searched for hope among the ashes. Yet in the quiet shadow of victory, another conflict was already taking shape. On the Korean Peninsula, decades of foreign rule had come to an end. The surrender of Japan in 1945 closed a painful chapter, but the promise of freedom did not bring unity. Instead, powerful nations looked upon Korea not as a homeland, but as a frontier in a growing struggle between rival ideologies. A line was drawn across the land at the 38th parallel. It was meant to be temporary, a simple administrative division after the chaos of war. But the ink on the map carried the weight of global ambition. Soviet forces entered the north, while American forces moved into the south, each shaping the future in their own image. Mountains and rivers that once connected villages now divided families. Farmers tending fields found themselves living in different worlds despite sharing the same language and traditions. What was once one nation slowly became two competing visions of the future. In the south, a government emerged under Syngman Rhee, a leader determined to build a state aligned with Western powers. In the north, Kim Il-sung rose with the backing of the Soviet Union, promising a revolutionary path guided by communism. Both leaders claimed legitimacy, and neither accepted the division as permanent. Speeches echoed across the peninsula, each promising reunification, each declaring that history was on their side. Hope mixed with suspicion as citizens wondered whether peace could survive in a world increasingly shaped by fear. Small clashes began along the border. Armed patrols crossed invisible lines in the night. Villages heard distant gunfire carried by the wind. These early confrontations were brief, but each one deepened resentment and hardened resolve. Both governments began building armies. Weapons flowed in from foreign allies, and young men were trained for a conflict many believed was inevitable. The peninsula became a meeting point of global tension, where the ambitions of distant capitals would soon collide. Across the world, the Cold War intensified. Nuclear weapons had changed the meaning of power, and every regional crisis carried the risk of something far greater. Korea, once overlooked, now stood at the center of a dangerous balance between East and West. By the end of the 1940s, the temporary border had hardened into a fault line. Political speeches spoke of unity, but preparations spoke of war. The dream of one Korea remained alive in the hearts of its people. Yet the path toward that dream was growing darker with each passing day. The stage was set. To governments, to ideologies, and one divided homeland waited in uneasy silence. Soon, the quiet tension would erupt into open conflict, and the peninsula would become the battlefield of a new global struggle. If you value stories that go beyond headlines and reveal the forces shaping nations, you are in the right place. At Polity Pictures, we explore the power, strategy, and history that define our world. Subscribe and stay with us as we uncover the stories that governments rarely explain and textbooks rarely simplify, because understanding power is the first step to understanding the future. Before sunrise on June 25, 1950, the silence along the border was broken by thunder. Artillery shells tore through the darkness as northern forces surged across the 38th parallel. The invasion had begun, and the fragile peace collapsed in a matter of hours. Columns of tanks rolled forward through narrow valleys, their engines echoing against the hills. Soldiers advanced behind armored vehicles that seemed unstoppable. Many southern troops had never faced such weapons, and their defenses quickly began to crumble. Villages awoke to the sound of explosions. Families fled along dusty roads, carrying what little they could hold. Smoke rose into the morning sky as homes were abandoned in fear of what was coming next. Northern commanders believed that the campaign would be swift. Their forces were experienced, many hardened by years of fighting in other wars. They moved with confidence, convinced that resistance would collapse before the advance reached the southern capital. Southern defenses struggled to respond. Their army lacked tanks and had limited weapons capable of stopping armored columns. Units were forced into chaotic withdrawals as communication lines broke down and orders became unclear. The capital city of Seoul soon stood in danger. Bridges crossing the Han River became crowded with soldiers and civilians trying to escape the approaching front. Fear spread faster than the advancing army, and confusion turned retreat into tragedy. Explosives destroyed key bridges in an attempt to slow the advance, but thousands were left stranded on the wrong side. Many soldiers found themselves cut off, unable to regroup with their units as the enemy closed in. Within days, Seoul fell. Government officials fled south, leaving behind a city uncertain of its future. Some residents watched the arriving northern troops with cautious curiosity, unsure whether they brought liberation or danger. The rapid collapse shocked observers around the world. What had seemed like a distant regional tension was now a full-scale war. Reports of advancing armored divisions and retreating defenders reached foreign capitals with alarming speed. The invasion did more than redraw battle lines. It transformed Korea into the first violent confrontation of the Cold War. Powerful nations now faced a decision that could shape the balance of global power for decades to come. As northern forces continued pushing south, the conflict expanded beyond the peninsula. The world watched closely, knowing that the struggle unfolding in Korea might be only the beginning of a much larger storm. News of the invasion spread quickly across the world, reaching distant capitals with a sense of urgency. Leaders feared that the attack was not an isolated conflict, but part of a wider expansion of communist influence. The fragile balance of the Cold War now seemed in danger of collapse. In Washington, President Harry Truman made a decisive choice. American forces stationed in Japan were ordered to move toward the Korean Peninsula. The decision marked the first major military response of the United Nations, transforming a civil conflict into an international war. The United Nations Security Council approved military assistance for South Korea. With the Soviet Union absent from the vote, the resolution passed, opening the way for a coalition of nations to join the defense. Soldiers from many countries prepared to fight under a single command. Troops from across the globe began their long journey toward an unfamiliar land. Some came from nations still recovering from the destruction of the previous World War. Others saw the conflict as a duty and a growing ideological struggle that seemed to threaten every continent. American soldiers were among the first to arrive, rushed from occupation duties in Japan. Many were young and untested, their equipment worn and supplies limited. Years of demobilization after the Second World War had left the army unprepared for another sudden conflict. The first encounters were devastating. At Osan, lightly armed infantry faced advancing tanks with weapons that proved ineffective. The sound of metal tracks crushing the road echoed through the valley as soldiers struggled to slow the armored assault. Defensive lines continued to fall. Cities that had once been filled with markets and daily life became crowded with refugees moving south. Long lines of civilians stretched along roads, carrying children and belongings as distant artillery rumbled behind them. Fear of hidden enemy soldiers among refugee columns created tragic consequences. Suspicion and confusion sometimes turned deadly, as the chaos of retreat blurred the line between civilian and combatant. The war was already leaving deep scars on the population. By late summer, United Nations forces were pushed toward the southeastern corner of the peninsula. A defensive perimeter formed near the port city of Busan there. Exhausted troops prepared to make a final stand against the advancing Northern Army. New reinforcements arrived daily, bringing tanks, artillery, and aircraft that slowly strengthened the defensive line. Air power began striking supply routes, offering a crucial advantage that would soon influence the course of the war. The conflict had now drawn in nations from across the world. What began as a struggle between two Koreas had become a global confrontation. On the edge of the sea, surrounded by mountains and uncertainty, the defenders prepared for a battle that would decide the future of the peninsula. By late summer 1950, the war had reached a moment of desperation. United Nations forces were pressed tightly into a shrinking defensive line near Busan. Behind them lay the sea, and before them advanced an enemy determined to finish the campaign. Yet far from the front lines, a bold plan was taking shape. General Douglas MacArthur believed the tide of war could be reversed through a daring strike deep behind enemy positions. The target was the port city of Incheon, a place of shifting tides and narrow approaches that many believed impossible to assault. The waters near Renshan were unpredictable. Tides rose and fell dramatically, exposing vast mudflats that could trap landing forces. The window for attack would be short, leaving little room for error. Still, the gamble promised the chance to cut enemy supply lines and force a sudden retreat. On September 15, the operation began. Warships moved silently through the mist as troops prepared to land. The rhythm of waves mixed with distant explosions as the first soldiers stepped onto the shoreline. Resistance was lighter than expected, allowing the advance to gain momentum. Forces quickly secured key positions, opening the way toward Seoul. The sudden appearance of enemy troops behind their lines shocked northern commanders. Supply routes were threatened, and communication began to break down as pressure mounted from multiple directions. At the same time, defenders at Busan began pushing forward. The Northern Army now faced danger from both front and rear. Their rapid advance south had stretched their resources, and the surprise landing forced a hurried withdrawal. Fighting intensified as the battle for Seoul unfolded once again. Streets that had only recently changed hands became battlegrounds once more. Buildings were damaged by artillery fire as soldiers moved block by block to regain control of the capital. As the northern forces retreated, evidence of political violence emerged in the cities they had occupied. Civilians found themselves caught between shifting authorities, unsure which side would ultimately prevail. Fear followed the changing front lines. Within weeks, the strategic situation had reversed. United Nations forces regained lost territory and began moving north toward the 38th parallel. Confidence grew that the war might soon be decided in their favor. But beyond the mountains to the north, another power was watching closely. Leaders in China feared the arrival of foreign troops near their border. What seemed like victory was about to draw a new force into the conflict. The success at Incheon changed the direction of the war, but it also widened its scale. The conflict was no longer only about the future of Korea. It had become a struggle that would test the balance of power across the entire region. As United Nations forces advanced deeper into the north, confidence grew that the war was nearing its end. Columns of soldiers moved through rugged mountains, believing reunification was now within reach. Yet, beyond the Yalu River, a new army was gathering in silence. China saw the approaching forces as a direct threat to its security. Leaders feared that a hostile presence along their border could lead to invasion. Determined to prevent this, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers began crossing into Korea under the cover of darkness. The first encounters came suddenly. Patrols reported unfamiliar voices echoing through the hills at night. Then the silence shattered with bugles, whistles, and gunfire. Waves of soldiers emerged from the shadows, striking isolated units with overwhelming speed. Confusion spread through advancing formations. Roads became crowded with vehicles attempting to withdraw as communication faltered. Soldiers who had expected victory now struggled simply to survive the relentless attacks coming from the mountains. Winter tightened its grip on the peninsula. Temperatures fell far below freezing, turning rivers into solid ice and covering the ground in snow. Weapons jammed, engines failed, and frostbite became as dangerous as enemy fire. Near the Chosin Reservoir, some of the harshest fighting unfolded. Surrounded by steep hills and icy winds, United Nations troops fought to keep supply routes open. Every movement was slowed by snow, and every step carried the risk of ambush. Columns attempting to break through enemy positions encountered blocked roads and destroyed bridges. Supplies were dropped from aircraft as troops struggled to hold their ground in freezing darkness. Many soldiers faced exhaustion beyond anything they had known before. Retreat became unavoidable. Long lines of troops and civilians moved toward the port of Hungnam, hoping to escape before the advancing forces closed the final routes. Ships waited offshore as explosions echoed across the harbor. The evacuation became one of the largest of the war. Soldiers, vehicles, and thousands of refugees crowded onto vessels that carried them away from the collapsing front. Behind them, the port was destroyed to prevent its use by the advancing army. The sudden reversal shocked commanders and politicians alike. What had seemed like a decisive victory had turned into a desperate struggle to hold the line. The war had entered a new phase, defined by endurance rather than rapid advance. In the frozen mountains of Korea, hope of a quick end had vanished. The conflict had grown larger, deadlier, and far more uncertain. The peninsula was now the stage for a prolonged war that neither side could easily win. By early 1951, the front line hardened near the same boundary where the war had begun. Hills scarred by explosions became defensive positions, and soldiers dug deep into the earth to survive constant shelling. The conflict slowed, but the danger never faded. Seoul changed hands once again as United Nations forces pushed north and communist armies withdrew toward the 38th parallel. The city's streets bore the marks of repeated battles, its people forced to adapt to a life shaped by uncertainty. New leadership brought changes in strategy. Training improved as commanders emphasized flexibility and defense in difficult terrain. Soldiers learned to fight without relying entirely on vehicles, adapting to the rugged mountains that defined the battlefield. Meanwhile, negotiations began in distant conference rooms. Delegates discussed ceasefire lines and prisoner exchanges while the sound of artillery continued to echo across the hills. Talks often stalled, as each side sought advantage before agreeing to peace. In the sky above Korea, a new kind of battle unfolded. Jet aircraft streaked across the clouds in fast and dangerous encounters. Pilots maneuvered at incredible speeds, testing the limits of both technology and human skill. Despite technological advances, much of the war on the ground resembled earlier conflicts. Trenches stretched across hillsides, reinforced with sandbags and barbed wire. Patrols moved cautiously through narrow valleys where even small attacks could cause heavy losses. Night battles became common. Searchlights illuminated ridge lines as defenders prepared for sudden assaults. The darkness carried the sound of footsteps, distant whistles, and the tension of knowing that danger could appear at any moment. Both sides launched limited offensives to gain small advantages in negotiations. Hills with little strategic value became symbols of determination. Positions changed hands repeatedly, each attack adding to the growing number of casualties. Extreme weather tested endurance as soldiers faced freezing winters and humid summers. Disease spread through crowded trenches, and exhaustion affected morale. The war had become a struggle not only against the enemy, but against the environment itself. As months turned into years, hopes for reunification faded. Neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough, and both paid a heavy price for every small gain. The conflict had transformed into a war of attrition, where survival became the primary objective. The world watched as negotiations slowly moved forward. The outcome remained uncertain, but one truth had become clear. The Korean War would not end with a dramatic victory, but with a difficult compromise shaped by sacrifice and exhaustion. By 1953, the war had consumed millions of lives and reshaped the political landscape of the world. Cities lay in ruins, families remained separated, and soldiers on both sides waited for a decision that had taken years to reach. The fighting had slowed, but the suffering had not. Negotiations continued through long months of disagreement. One of the most difficult questions involved prisoners of war. Many captured soldiers refused to return to their homelands, fearing punishment or political persecution. The issue delayed peace as leaders struggled to find a solution acceptable to all sides. Meanwhile, global tensions remained high. The possibility of nuclear weapons entering the conflict cast a long shadow over negotiations. The world understood that any escalation could transform a regional war into a catastrophe without limits. Changes in leadership created new opportunities for compromise. Political pressure, economic strain, and the cost of continued fighting pushed all sides toward agreement. The desire to end the bloodshed slowly overcame the demand for total victory. On July 27, 1953, an armistice was finally signed. Representatives from the main forces agreed to halt the fighting, bringing an end to 3 years of relentless conflict. The guns fell silent, but the war itself was not officially concluded. A demilitarized zone was established along the front line, creating a buffer between north and south. Barbed wire and guard posts marked a border that still exists today. Families separated by the war remained divided, unable to cross the heavily guarded frontier. As the ceasefire took effect, soldiers cautiously emerged from their positions. Across the scoured landscape, former enemies observed one another in uneasy silence. The long years of violence had ended without a decisive victor. The human cost of the war was staggering. Millions of civilians were killed, wounded, or displaced. Entire communities vanished, and survivors carried memories that would shape generations to come. Each side claimed success in its own way. Some argued that the invasion had been stopped, preserving independence in the South. Others believed survival itself was a victory for the North. Yet for many, the outcome felt incomplete, a pause rather than a true peace. The Korean War left a lasting mark on global politics. It strengthened military alliances, intensified the Cold War, and demonstrated how quickly regional tensions could draw in powerful nations. The fear of wider conflict remained present long after the final shots were fired. Even today, the peninsula remains divided by the same line drawn in the aftermath of the Second World War. The armistice ended the fighting, but it did not heal the wounds of the past. The Korean War stands as a reminder of how fragile peace can be when ideology, power, and human lives collide. The world is changing faster than ever, and every nation carries a story that shapes the global balance. At Polity Pictures, we bring those stories to life through cinematic journeys into power, politics, and history. If you seek depth instead of noise, perspective instead of propaganda, this channel is for you. Subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the forces that move the world. The next story begins now.